Hey, welcome to our last session of the Irresistible Community. I'm wearing my Force Burdette hat to just show my support for the Force Burdette team and thank you for your interaction and involvement in this small group and your patience and willingness to allow me to teach via YouTube. And I have really enjoyed this time together, and I look forward to our time together in person to maybe discuss different parts of Ephesians more thoroughly. The last section that I want to try to touch on today is commonly called the household code. And I really can't do it justice in probably an hour, much less 15 minutes. But what I want to do is summarize it, and then we can discuss it further in person when we meet in just a few days. I want to also share the reason that I can't do justice because I'm writing a 20 to 25 page paper on this subject right now, and so there's just unbelievable amounts of information out there. And what I can do is I can post that paper. There's my cat Tuesday saying thank you and goodbye. I can post this paper on the Irresistible Community website in case you would want to read it. But what we can do is touch upon it and discuss it further when we gather together in just a few days. First of all, a household code was something that already existed before Paul was alive. It appears in the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 5, Colossians chapter 3, 1 Peter chapter 3. It was a literary form, just like a poem is a literary form. It was something that was borrowed upon. And according to New Testament scholars, a literary form or a literary genre is used to communicate. It's not used just as a container to house words. And so it's important to see that Peter and Paul are deliberately choosing to use a household code, something that we really find its origin several centuries BC with philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Basically, the purpose of having a household code was to establish order not only within the home, but also within the state. Because according to Aristotle, the home was a microcosm of the state. The home was a reflection of the state. If there wasn't order in the home, there couldn't be order in the state. Because the state was essentially composed of cities that were composed of villages that were composed of houses. And so if there was disorder in the house, there could possibly be disorder in the village, and so on and so forth. I think that we can see the implications of that in our own society, that there's not a whole lot of order in a lot of homes, and so we are reaping the repercussions of that now with a lack of parenting, a lack of love between spouses, divorce, and all kinds of problems with adolescents getting involved in drugs. And we can see the implications in our own society of what happens whenever a home is out of order. And so it was important for the ancient thinkers to develop a hierarchy to establish order. And it was the emperor who was the ruler over the city, and the citizens as his subjects. That was the massive scale of the order of the ancient world. And the people in the city were subject to him. They were supposed to submit to him. On a smaller scale, the husband, the man, is the ruler of the house, and so his wife and his children and his slaves are subject and submissive to him. And so if they can't be subject and submissive to their own to the man of the house, then there are implications for what's going to happen in the greater culture, in their village, in their city, in their state. So Peter and Paul, they both implement this into their writings in the New Testament. It appears that Peter uses it as an apologetic purpose. He uses it as a defense because rumors were growing against Eastern religions like Judaism and Christianity that they were somewhat bringing disorder to the state. Definitely, Romans did not like Christianity. They did not like Judaism because they were both monotheistic, and they didn't have idols. They didn't have any kind of physical representation of of their God. And so the Romans called Jews and Christians atheists because they couldn't see their gods. So we find people like Josephus and Philo, who were Hellenistic Jews, writing household codes to demonstrate that they weren't trying to be subversive to the state. And so this appears to be the same reason that Peter is writing in 1 Peter chapter 3 for wives to subject themselves to their husbands in order that they might win their husbands over to Christianity. And what's interesting is that according to Plutarch, who was an ethicist, someone who was proposing what a household ethic should be in the first century Greco-Roman world, Plutarch said that a wife should, without a doubt, be worshiping at the altar of her husband's gods. When she gets married, she should leave the altars of her father's gods and begin to worship at the altar of her husband's gods. It was completely prohibited for women to have their own religion. What's interesting is that Peter doesn't say anything about that. He doesn't say, "Okay, women, you need to leave Christianity and go back to your husband's gods." So there's already some liberality in the message of the New Testament authors. They're saying, hey, you can go against the social constructs and worship the God Yahweh and the Lord Jesus freely. And so what's interesting is that Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 3, women, subject yourselves, wives, subject yourselves to your husbands, so that without a word you might win them over. And the idea here is a little bit ironic, because women were not supposed to worship their own God. But Peter is saying not only can you worship your own God, but through your lifestyle you might be able to convert your husband. And there is some wordplay going on here in 1 Peter, because one of the greatest virtues of a wife in the first century world was silence. And so basically Peter is saying, be silent, be able to embrace the virtues of your society in order that you might be able to win your husband over. The ones who are disobedient, who don't obey the word, you might be able to win them over without a word. And so there's definitely some wordplay going on. It was pretty significant, because the first century world, words were so important, so much more important than they are today, because of the art of rhetoric, which was the art of persuasion. And so basically, people in the first century world would try to persuade other people through convincing arguments to join some kind of cause, and people were actually paid lots of money who could convince other people. They were called orators. And so basically Peter is saying, let your life be your rhetoric. Let your life be an example to your husbands of what it means to be a Christian. Don't try to convince them with words, but convince them without a word. So there's some interesting stuff going on there for sure. One thing that we can be sure about in both Peter and Paul is that they're not talking about women being inferior to men in general. They do use the word gyneke, which is woman, but they clarify it with the adverb idios, which means one's own man. And that is definitely qualifying that these women are supposed to subject themselves to their husbands, not to all the other men in the society. Women are not inferior. He's talking specifically about order in the household. So that kind of, we can put a check mark beside that misnomer that women in the ancient world were just in general seen as to be seen as inferior to men. No, this is talking about the social constructs of the household. So when we come back to Ephesians chapter 5, we see that Paul is creating an analogy. Wives are to subject themselves to their husbands, and he gives a reason in verse 23, because husbands are the head of the wife, just as Christ is head of the church. Now what's interesting is that Plato develops an analogy called the analogy of the man and the city. And it's basically what I've already explained, that the house and the city are parallel to one another. And so it appears that maybe Paul is borrowing this idea that the relationship of husband and wife that would have been understood in the Greco-Roman ancient world is to be understood in the church. And he's doing that to explain the order of Christ being the head, which is a political word. We've already discussed on several occasions that Ephesians is a highly charged political letter. And basically, I'm going to summarize that I believe that Paul is using this household code to reorient, to give a new Christian orientation to what it means to live in the household. It's going to be different than the household codes that they would have seen with Josephus and Philo, who were Hellenistic Jews writing in the first century. Paul was a lot more liberal towards women. And what we find implicit in Paul's writings is that men were also supposed to subject themselves to their wives, which was just a radical concept. Would not have been found in any other writings. And it's not explicit, but he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And the idea is that Christ subjected himself to death on a cross. And so husbands are supposed to subject themselves in their love and their sacrifice to their wives. And so there's mutual submission going on. This was a totally radical idea. Paul would have been viewed as radical, would have been viewed as liberal in his day. And so there's a lot to unpack here. Maybe I should just conclude by saying that the general exhortation in verse 21 is subject yourselves to one another in the fear of Christ. And the purpose behind the rest between the relationship of wife to husband, husband to wife, and children in 6:1, and the latter part of the household code in chapter 6 with masters and slaves, it's all about being subject to Christ. And we find this at the very end in verse 9, whenever Paul basically says, you know, masters, you need to be ethical in the way that you treat your slaves, because you have the same master who is in heaven. So in a world where slaves were not really even viewed as human beings, they were viewed as property, what was called chattel. Paul is definitely saying something pretty significant here. He's saying, you know, you need to treat these people as human beings with dignity because you have the same master. So subject yourselves, submit yourselves even to slaves. 6:1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your mother and your father. And then fathers, do not provoke your children. This is how children and fathers are supposed to submit themselves to one another. So ultimately, we're supposed to subject ourselves one to another. This is what it means to be a part of the economy of Christ. This is what Paul is talking about whenever he uses the word administration, whenever he uses the word household, because there was a household of Caesar. It was a city. The church is the house of Christ, and Christ is the head of the house. And so we're supposed to subject ourselves to one another as the church is subjecting itself to Christ. So Paul is once again calling his audience to live a different way, live a way that is counterintuitive to the rest of culture. And I exhort you, those at Force Burdett, subject yourselves to one another, serving each other, loving each other, listening to each other, because this is what it means to be a part of the kingdom. This is what it means for Christ to be head of the church. Grace and peace to you.